The attic door groaned like a dying animal as I pushed it open, releasing a wave of musty air that stung my nose with the sharp tang of rust and something darker, something I couldn't place. I was 17, stuck at home on a gray Saturday afternoon in Willow Creek, the kind of small town where boredom could drive you to do stupid things, like snooping through your grandfather's old house. He'd moved in with us after Grandma passed last year, his presence a quiet shadow in our lives. I always thought he was just a gruff old man, weathered by time, with his heavy boots and calloused hands, the kind who'd slip you a crumpled $5 bill when Mom wasn't looking. But that day, October 12, 2024, I found something that made me question everything I thought I knew about him. The attic was a maze of forgotten things, stacks of yellowed newspapers, a cracked mirror leaning against a beam, and boxes of junk Grandma probably hadn't touched in decades. I wasn't supposed to be up here. Grandpa had made that clear the one time I'd asked about the attic, his voice sharp, eyes cold. "Nothing for you up there, kid," he'd said, and I'd let it go. But today, with Mom at work and Grandpa out for his usual errands, curiosity got the better of me. I'd climbed the rickety pull-down ladder, my phone's flashlight cutting through the dimness, my sneakers scuffing against the dusty floorboards. I started poking around, lifting lids off cardboard boxes, finding nothing but old clothes and chipped dishes. Then I noticed a loose plank near the far corner, where the roof slanted low and the shadows seemed thicker. It was out of place, slightly raised, like it had been pried up and set back down too many times. My heart gave a little kick, the kind you get when you know you're about to cross a line. I knelt, my fingers brushing the rough wood, and tugged. The plank came up easier than I expected, revealing a dark hollow beneath. Inside was a metal lockbox, its edges rusted, the latch scratched like someone had forced it open more than once. I hesitated, my pulse loud in my ears. This wasn't like flipping through Grandma's old recipe cards. This felt wrong, private, like I was digging into something meant to stay buried. But I couldn't stop. I wedged a screwdriver from a nearby toolbox under the latch and popped it open with a dull snap. The lid creaked as I lifted it, and the air seemed to thicken, pressing against my skin. Inside was no treasure, no family heirlooms, just a stack of Polaroids, a coiled rope, and a small knife, its blade stained with something dark and uneven. I picked up the photos, my hands unsteady. There were 6 of them, each showing a young woman, maybe in her 20s, smiling or laughing, caught in moments that felt too alive for the attic's dead air. They wore bell-bottoms or flannel, hairstyles from decades ago, frozen in time. I flipped one over and saw red ink scrawled on the back. Ellen, 1972. Another read, Mary, 1981. The dates went on. 1975, 1987, 1992, 1998. None of the names meant anything to me, but the way the ink bled into the paper, uneven and shaky, made my stomach twist. The rope was rough, frayed at the ends, and the knife. I didn't touch it. The stains weren't rust. I knew that much. I sat back on my heels, the photos trembling in my hands. My first thought was that Grandpa was a collector, maybe a weird hobbyist who bought creepy stuff at flea markets. But the dates, the specificity, they didn't feel random. And that smell, the metallic tang that clung to the box, wasn't just in my head. I shoved the photos back inside, closed the lid, and slid the box under the plank, pressing it down until it looked untouched. My chest was tight, my breath shallow, as I scrambled down the ladder, shutting the attic door behind me. Downstairs, the house felt too quiet, the ticking of the kitchen clock like a heartbeat. I stood at the sink, washing my hands over and over, trying to scrub away the feeling of those photos, the weight of what they might mean. Grandpa was just an old man, I told myself. He liked fishing, told bad jokes, and drank black coffee every morning. But I kept seeing his hands, scarred, thick-fingered, always gripping something too tightly. And the way he'd look at me sometimes, like he was measuring me, like he knew I'd been somewhere I shouldn't. I tried to distract myself, scrolling through my phone, but my mind kept circling back to the box. What were those photos? Why were they hidden? And the knife, God, the knife. I opened my laptop and started searching, typing "Willow Creek missing persons" into the browser. The results hit like a punch. Our town, small as it was, had a string of disappearances stretching back decades. Women, mostly young, vanishing without a trace. Ellen Harper, 1972. Mary Klein, 1981. Susan Wells, 1987. The names matched. My mouth went dry, and I slammed the laptop shut. The front door rattled, and I jumped, my heart slamming against my ribs. Grandpa's boots thudded on the porch, heavy and deliberate. I shoved my phone under a couch cushion and tried to look normal, grabbing a glass of water and leaning against the counter. He walked in, his coat damp from the drizzle outside, his eyes scanning the room before landing on me. "You okay, kid?" he asked, his voice low, rough, like gravel underfoot. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak, and forced a smile. He didn't smile back, just hung his coat and headed to his room, the door clicking shut behind him. I stood there, gripping the glass, my reflection distorted in the kitchen window. The Polaroids were burned into my mind, those women, their smiles, their dates. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't unsee what I'd found. The house felt smaller, the walls closer, and for the first time, I realized I was afraid of the man I'd known my whole life. The kitchen clock ticked louder than it should have, each second slicing into the silence that followed Grandpa's retreat to his room. I stood frozen at the counter, the glass of water in my hand now lukewarm, my reflection in the window a pale ghost staring back. The Polaroids from the attic, Ellen, Mary, Susan, and the others, clawed at my thoughts, their frozen smiles and red-inked dates refusing to fade. I was 17, too old to believe in monsters under the bed, but the rusted lockbox under the attic floorboards felt like something worse. Something real. Something that lived in this house with me. I dumped the water in the sink and moved to the living room, my sneakers silent on the worn carpet. The house was too still, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every creak, every shift. I kept glancing at Grandpa's door, expecting it to swing open, expecting him to know I'd been in the attic. His words echoed in my head, "You okay, kid?" And the way his eyes had lingered, narrow and searching, like he could see the guilt written on my face. I'd nodded, but I wasn't okay. Not even close. I sank onto the couch, pulling my knees to my chest, and tried to piece it together. The lockbox, the knife, the rope, they could be nothing, right? Grandpa was just an old man, 68, with a bad knee and a habit of muttering to himself when he thought no one was listening. He'd fought in Vietnam, Mom said once, and that made him private, closed off. Maybe the photos were from friends, old girlfriends, or some weird hobby. But the stains on the knife weren't rust. I'd seen enough true crime shows to know what dried blood looked like, even if I didn't want to admit it. I grabbed my phone and opened the browser again, my fingers hesitating over the keys. The Willow Creek missing persons articles were still open in my tabs, and I scrolled through them, each headline tightening the knot in my stomach. Ellen Harper, 1972, last seen leaving a grocery store. Mary Klein, 1981, vanished after a late shift at the diner. Susan Wells, 1987, never made it home from a friend's house. The dates matched the Polaroids exactly. I clicked on Ellen's article, her grainy photo staring back at me, blonde hair, wide smile, just like the girl in the attic. My hands shook, and I set the phone down, afraid I'd drop it. Grandpa's door creaked, and I flinched, shoving the phone under a cushion. His boots thudded softly as he walked to the kitchen, the fridge door opening with a faint suck of air. I held my breath, listening to the clink of a glass, the gurgle of water from the tap. Normal sounds, but they felt wrong, like a mask he was wearing. I thought about how he always locked his bedroom door at night, the click of the bolt loud enough to hear from my room down the hall. I'd never thought much of it before. Old people were weird, right? But now, it felt like he was hiding something. Or someone. I waited until he shuffled back to his room, the door clicking shut, before I moved. My heart was racing, but I needed to do something, anything, to shake the images in my head. I grabbed a notebook from my backpack and started writing down what I'd seen, the lockbox, the 6 photos, the names, the dates. I sketched the knife as best I could, its curved handle and stained blade, my pencil scratching too loud in the quiet house. Writing it down made it real, and that scared me more than anything. The next morning, I watched him over breakfast. He sat at the kitchen table, sipping black coffee, his hands wrapped around the mug like it was an anchor. His knuckles were scarred, white lines crisscrossing the skin, and I couldn't stop staring. Had those hands held that knife? Tied that rope? I pushed my cereal around, my appetite gone, and tried to act normal. "Cold out today," he said, not looking up from his coffee. His voice was gravelly, the same as always, but it felt different now, like a threat hidden in plain sight. I mumbled something about school and left the table, my skin prickling. At school, I couldn't focus. My history teacher droned on about the Cold War, but all I could think about was the attic. I kept picturing the Polaroids, the women's faces, their smiles so unaware. During lunch, I hid in the library, using the school computer to dig deeper. I found another article, this one about a woman named Claire Dunn, missing since 1998, the last date in the lockbox. She'd worked at a diner a mile from our house, last seen walking home after closing. The article mentioned the creek nearby, a place Grandpa used to talk about, where he'd clear his head on long walks. I felt sick, my hands clammy as I logged out. That night, I lay awake, the house creaking around me. Every sound felt like him, his boots, his hands, his secrets. I started noticing things I hadn't before, how he'd get quiet when Mom watched true crime shows, how he'd change the channel if a detective mentioned cold cases. Once, I'd caught him staring at the TV during a news segment about a missing hiker, his face blank, unreadable. I'd thought he was just zoned out, but now I wondered what he'd been thinking. I started keeping my door locked at night, my pocketknife under my pillow. It was small, a cheap thing I'd bought at a gas station, but it made me feel less helpless. I didn't know what I'd do if he came for me, but I couldn't shake the fear that he knew I'd been in the attic. The way he'd looked at me yesterday, the weight of his gaze, it was like he could see right through me. I kept replaying our conversations, searching for clues. He'd always been private, but now every word, every glance, felt like a puzzle piece I was too scared to fit together. By the end of the week, I was barely sleeping, my eyes red, my hands shaky. Mom noticed, asking if I was stressed about school, but I couldn't tell her. What would I say? I think Grandpa's a murderer. She'd never believe me, not without proof. And if she confronted him? I didn't want to think about what he might do. I needed to know more, but the attic felt too dangerous now, like a trap waiting to spring. Instead, I started watching him closer, memorizing his routines, coffee at 7 a.m., errands at noon, drives at dusk. He'd leave the house after dinner, his truck rumbling down the road, and I'd wonder where he was going, what he was doing in the dark. The metallic smell from the attic haunted me, clinging to my clothes, my thoughts. I couldn't shake the image of that knife, the rope, the names in red ink. I was living with a man I didn't know anymore, and every moment in this house felt like a countdown to something I couldn't predict. The hum of the library's fluorescent lights buzzed in my ears like a trapped insect, a constant reminder that I was somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. It was Monday morning, October 14, 2024, and I'd skipped school, my backpack slung over one shoulder as I hunched over a microfiche reader in the Willow Creek Public Library. The Polaroids from Grandpa's attic, Ellen, Mary, Susan, and the others, were seared into my brain, their smiles haunting me like ghosts I couldn't shake. I'd barely slept since finding the lockbox, the metallic tang of its contents clinging to my thoughts, mixing with the fear that Grandpa knew I'd been snooping. His narrowed eyes over breakfast yesterday, the way he'd lingered on my face before grunting and turning back to his coffee, it felt like a warning. The library was nearly empty, just a bored librarian sorting books and an old man flipping through a newspaper. I'd chosen the microfiche station in the back, hidden by a row of shelves, where no one could see the screen. My hands shook as I loaded the first reel, a collection of Willow Creek Gazette issues from the 1970s. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but the names and dates from the Polaroids, 1972, 1981, 1987, 1992, 1998, pushed me forward. I needed answers, something to prove I wasn't losing my mind, that the knife and rope in that rusted box weren't just relics of a harmless old man's past. The machine whirred, and grainy headlines flickered onto the screen. I scanned them, my heart thudding with every mention of missing or disappeared. Willow Creek was small, barely 10,000 people, but the articles told a darker story. Women had vanished here, more than I'd ever realized, their cases fading into the town's quiet history. I found Ellen Harper first. July 1972. 23 years old, blonde, a cashier at the corner market. Last seen leaving work, her car found abandoned on Route 17. The article described her as beloved, her family pleading for answers that never came. I stared at her photo, the same smile I'd seen in the Polaroid, and my stomach lurched. The date matched. I kept going, my fingers clumsy on the machine's dials. Mary Klein, 1981. 26, a waitress at the Blue Moon Diner, vanished after locking up one night. Her purse was found in a ditch near the creek, but no trace of her. Another match. Susan Wells, 1987, 21, a college student home for the summer. She'd been walking to a friend's house near the old mill when she disappeared. Her photo, too, was in the lockbox, her dark eyes bright with a smile that didn't know what was coming. I scribbled the names and dates in my notebook, my handwriting jagged, the pencil digging into the paper. Each article felt like a punch, the details piling up like stones in my chest. These weren't just names, they were lives, snuffed out, forgotten. And Grandpa had their pictures, hidden away like trophies. I tried to tell myself there was another explanation. Maybe he was a cop once, or a private investigator, keeping records for a case. But he'd been a mechanic, Mom said, working at the garage on Main Street for 30 years. No badge, no uniform, just grease-stained hands and a quiet life. The kind of life that didn't explain a stained knife or a rope coiled tight enough to hold someone still. I moved to the 1990s, my eyes burning from the screen's glare. Claire Dunn, 1998, 24, another waitress, this time at a diner a mile from our house. Last seen walking home after a late shift, her jacket found snagged on a fence near the creek. The date was the last one in the lockbox, but her photo wasn't there. I wondered why, my mind spinning. Had he stopped taking pictures? Or was her photo somewhere else, hidden deeper? The creek kept coming up in the articles, a thread tying the cases together. Grandpa used to talk about it, how he'd walk there to clear his head. I'd never thought much of it, but now it felt like a confession I hadn't understood. I leaned back, my head throbbing, the library's silence pressing against me. The old man at the newspaper table coughed, and I jumped, my heart racing like I'd been caught. I checked my phone, 11:30 a.m. Grandpa would be at the garage, Mom at the hospital working her shift. I had time, but not much. I printed copies of the articles, the machine spitting out grainy pages that smelled like ink and dust. I stuffed them into my backpack, zipping it shut like I was sealing away a secret. Outside, the October air was sharp, the sky a flat gray that made the town look drained of color. I biked home, my legs burning, the articles heavy in my bag. Every car that passed made me flinch, half expecting Grandpa's rusted pickup to pull up beside me. I kept thinking about his hands, those scarred knuckles gripping the steering wheel, the same hands that might have held that knife. I'd always thought he was just gruff, a product of a hard life, but now every memory felt tainted. The way he'd snap if I got too close to his shed, the way he'd lock his bedroom door at night, the way he'd stare at the woods when we drove past the creek. Back home, I hid the articles under my mattress, my hands still shaking. I couldn't stop moving, pacing my room, checking the window every few minutes. The house felt alive, the walls creaking, the pipes groaning like they were whispering secrets. I kept my door locked now, my pocket knife in my pocket, its weight a small comfort. I didn't know what I was protecting myself from, not yet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that Grandpa's silence was louder than it seemed. Dinner that night was torture. Mom was home, chatting about her day, but I barely heard her. Grandpa sat across from me, cutting his steak with slow, deliberate strokes, the knife glinting under the kitchen light. I stared at his hands, the scars catching the glow, and my fork trembled in my grip. "You feeling okay, kid?" he asked, his voice low, his eyes locking onto mine. I nodded, forcing a smile, but my throat was tight, my food untouched. He didn't push, just went back to his plate, but I felt the weight of his gaze, like he was testing me. I lay awake that night, the articles under my mattress burning a hole through my thoughts. The women's faces, the dates, the creek, they were all connected, and Grandpa was at the center. I didn't know how to prove it, but I couldn't stop now. I needed more, something concrete, something that would make Mom believe me, something that would keep me safe. The house creaked, and I gripped my knife, listening for his footsteps in the dark. The dusk settled over Willow Creek like a heavy fog, the sky bruising purple as I pedaled my bike down the cracked asphalt of Route 17. It was October 15, 2024, and the chill in the air bit at my knuckles, but I barely felt it. My mind was locked on Grandpa, on the Polaroids, the knife, the rope, and the articles now hidden under my mattress: Ellen Harper, Mary Klein, Susan Wells, Claire Dunn. Their names looped in my head, each one tied to a date, a face, a place. The creek. The mill. The woods. Places Grandpa knew too well, places he'd mentioned in passing with a casualness that now felt like a taunt. I'd seen enough to know he wasn't just a quiet old man, but I needed more than photos and old news clippings. I needed to see what he was doing, where he was going when he slipped out after dinner, his truck keys jingling like a warning. I'd started watching him closer, mapping his routines like a detective in one of Mom's crime shows. He'd leave most evenings around 7 p.m., his pickup rumbling to life, headlights cutting through the dusk. He'd say he was going for a drive, and Mom never questioned it, just nodded and went back to her dishes. But I couldn't stop wondering, where did he go? What was he doing in the dark? Last night, I'd made up my mind to follow him. The idea had rooted itself while I lay awake, the articles under my mattress whispering accusations. I couldn't keep sitting still, waiting for answers to fall into my lap. I had to know. I'd told Mom I was meeting friends to study, a lie that came too easily. My bike was old, the chain rattling, but it was quiet enough to keep me unnoticed. I waited in the shadows of our driveway, crouched behind the garbage cans, until I heard the familiar growl of his truck. He backed out, the red taillights glowing like eyes, and I gave him a head start before pedaling after him. My heart pounded, not just from the effort but from the fear of being caught. What would he do if he saw me? The image of that stained knife flashed in my mind, and I gripped the handlebars tighter, pushing harder to keep up. He drove slow, deliberate, sticking to the back roads that wound through Willow Creek's outskirts. The town faded behind me, Main Street's dim streetlights, the shuttered diner, the gas station with its flickering neon sign. He turned onto a dirt road that led toward the creek, the same one mentioned in Claire Dunn's article. My tires crunched on gravel, and I slowed, keeping my distance, my phone's flashlight off to avoid detection. The truck's taillights bobbed ahead, disappearing around a bend. I stopped, hiding my bike in a ditch, and crept forward on foot, the underbrush snagging my jeans. The creek was a black ribbon under the fading light, its surface still, reflecting the skeletal trees that lined its banks. Grandpa's truck was parked on a small clearing, engine off, headlights dark. He sat inside, a shadow behind the wheel, unmoving. I crouched behind a cluster of pines, my breath shallow, the cold seeping through my jacket. What was he doing? There was no fishing rod, no binoculars, nothing to explain why he'd come here. Just him, staring into the dark, the silence so thick it felt like it could choke me. I waited, my legs cramping, my fingers numb. An hour passed, maybe more. He didn't move, didn't get out, just sat there, his head tilted slightly, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. The creek gurgled faintly, and I thought of the articles: Mary's purse in a ditch, Claire's jacket on a fence. This place wasn't just a quiet spot to think. It was a graveyard of secrets. My mind raced, picturing him here years ago, his hands on that rope, that knife. I wanted to run, to pedal back home and pretend I'd never come, but I was rooted, trapped by the need to know. Finally, he started the truck, the engine's roar shattering the silence. I ducked lower as he turned around, his headlights sweeping the trees, missing me by inches. He drove back toward town, and I waited until the taillights vanished before scrambling to my bike. My legs shook as I pedaled home, the dark pressing in, every rustle in the woods making me flinch. I kept seeing his silhouette in the truck, the way he'd sat so still, like a predator waiting for prey. When I got home, Mom was asleep on the couch, the TV flickering with some late-night talk show. Grandpa's truck was in the driveway, his bedroom door closed. I locked my door, my hands trembling as I added notes to my notebook. Creek, 7:45 p.m., 1 hour, no activity. It wasn't much, but it felt like proof, a piece of the puzzle. I couldn't stop thinking about the creek, how it tied to the disappearances, how Grandpa's walks to clear his head now seemed like something else entirely. The next day, I was a wreck. School was a blur, my teachers' voices drowned out by the memory of those taillights, that stillness. I kept checking my phone, half expecting a text from Grandpa, some cryptic message that he knew I'd followed him. At lunch, I hid in the bathroom, scrolling through more articles on my phone. I found a blog post from a local historian, mentioning the creek as a troubled spot in Willow Creek's past, linked to multiple disappearances. It wasn't just the women in the Polaroids, there were others, cases I hadn't connected yet. The blog mentioned the old mill, too, another place Grandpa had talked about, where Susan Wells was last seen. I started carrying my pocket knife everywhere, its weight a constant reminder of the danger I was flirting with. I didn't know what I'd do with it: stab him? Defend myself? The thought made me sick, but I couldn't let it go. Every night, I listened for his footsteps, the creak of his door, the jingle of his keys. I stopped sleeping, my eyes gritty, my thoughts a loop of fear and suspicion. He was hiding something, and I was getting closer to it, but every step felt like walking toward a cliff. At dinner, he was quieter than usual, his fork scraping the plate in slow, deliberate strokes. Mom chatted about work, oblivious, but I watched him, noting the way his jaw tightened when she mentioned a news story about a missing hiker in the next county. People need to be more careful, he said, his voice flat, his eyes flicking to me for a split second. I nodded, my throat dry, and excused myself early, my heart hammering. He knew something. I could feel it. I lay awake that night, the articles under my mattress, the knife in my hand, the creek's dark water flowing through my dreams. I was in too deep now, and there was no turning back. The air in my room felt thick, heavy with the weight of what I'd seen at the creek last night. Grandpa's truck parked in the dark, his silhouette motionless, staring into the void like he was waiting for something. It was October 16, 2024, and I hadn't slept more than a few hours in days, my eyes burning, my hands jittery from too much coffee and too little peace. The Polaroids, the articles, the knife, the rope, they were puzzle pieces, and the creek had added another, but I needed more. I needed proof, something undeniable, something that would make Mom believe me, something that would stop the gnawing fear that I was living with a monster. Grandpa's shed loomed in my mind, a squat, weathered structure at the edge of our backyard, its padlock glinting like a warning. He'd always been cagey about it, snapping at me when I was a kid and got too close, saying it was just tools and junk. But after the lockbox in the attic, I didn't believe him. The shed was another secret, and I was done waiting. Last night, after he'd come back from the creek, I'd snuck into his room while he was in the shower, my heart pounding so loud I thought he'd hear it through the walls. Under his dresser, taped to the underside, I'd found a small key, cold and heavy in my palm. It had to fit the shed's padlock. It had to. I waited until Thursday, when Grandpa left for his weekly poker game at the VFW hall. He'd be gone for hours, giving me time. Mom was working a double shift at the hospital, so the house was mine. The sky was a dull gray, the kind that made everything look washed out, lifeless. I stood at the back door, the key in my pocket knife in the other, its weight a small anchor against the fear bubbling in my chest. The shed sat at the far end of the yard, half hidden by overgrown grass and a sagging oak tree. I crossed the lawn, my sneakers sinking into the damp earth, every step feeling like a line I couldn't uncross. The padlock was rusted, but the key slid in smooth, clicking open with a sound that made my stomach lurch. I glanced back at the house, half expecting Grandpa's truck to pull into the driveway, but the street was empty. The shed door creaked as I pushed it open, releasing a wave of stale air. Oil, dirt, and something sharper, like metal left out too long. Inside was dark, the single window caked with grime, letting in only slivers of light. My phone's flashlight shook in my hand as I scanned the space, shelves of rusted tools, a lawnmower, a stack of paint cans. Nothing screamed serial killer, but I wasn't here for the obvious. In the corner, under a heavy tarp, I saw it, a wooden chest, its edges worn, a padlock dangling open like it was waiting for me. My breath caught, and I knelt, pulling the tarp back, the fabric rough against my fingers. The chest was heavy, solid, the kind of thing you'd use to hide something important. Or something terrible. I lifted the lid, the hinges groaning, and my flashlight beam fell on the contents, more Polaroids, a bundle of ropes, and a notebook, its cover stained, pages curling at the edges. My hands shook as I picked up the photos, more women, more smiles, more dates. Some were faded, but the red ink was clear. Laura, 1974, Diane, 1983, Rebecca, 1990. Names I hadn't seen in the attic box, but the handwriting matched, jagged and uneven. The notebook was worse. I flipped it open, and my heart stopped. Pages of entries, written in the same red ink, names, dates, descriptions. Ellen Harper, blonde, 5 feet 4 inches, taken near Route 17, July 12, 72. Mary Klein, brunette, 5 feet 6 inches, diner, March 15, 81. Each entry was precise, clinical, like a ledger of death. Some had check marks next to them, others didn't. I scanned for Claire Dunn, 1998, the last date from the attic, but she wasn't listed. My mind raced. Why not? Was she still out there? Or had he stopped writing things down? I was so lost in the notebook I didn't hear the truck until it was too late. The rumble of the engine cut through the silence, and I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. Headlights swept across the shed's window, and I dropped the notebook, scrambling to cover the chest with the tarp. My flashlight clattered to the floor, the beam spinning wildly. I couldn't get out the front, Grandpa was too close. I stumbled to the back of the shed, finding a small window, its frame warped and splintered. I shoved it open, the wood scraping my arm as I climbed through, landing hard in the wet grass outside. I crawled into the bushes, my breath ragged, my arm stinging where I'd cut it. Through the leaves, I saw Grandpa unlock the shed door, his silhouette filling the frame. He stepped inside, his boots heavy on the floor, and stood there, motionless, like he was listening. My heart pounded so loud I was sure he'd hear it. He stayed for 10 minutes, maybe longer, then locked the shed and walked back to the house, his steps slow, deliberate. I waited until the kitchen light flicked on before slipping out, my clothes damp with dew, my hands shaking as I biked to a neighbor's empty lot to hide. I didn't go home until I was sure he was asleep, sneaking in through the back door and locking my room. The notebook's pages burned in my mind, names, dates, check marks. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was real. Grandpa wasn't just a quiet old man. He was something else, something that made my skin crawl. I hid the key in my sock drawer, my pocket knife under my pillow, and lay awake, listening for his footsteps. The shed had given me answers, but they came with a cost. I wasn't just afraid of him now. I was afraid of what he'd do if he knew I'd seen. The cut on my arm throbbed under the bandage, a sharp reminder of my escape from the shed last night, the splintered window frame slicing into my skin as I fled from Grandpa's unexpected return. It was October 17, 2024, and I hadn't slept since, my body running on adrenaline and fear. The notebook I'd found in the shed, pages filled with names, dates, and chilling details, burned in my memory, each entry a nail in the coffin of the man I'd thought Grandpa was. Ellen Harper, Mary Klein, Susan Wells, and others, their lives reduced to red ink and check marks. The ropes, the Polaroids, the stained knife, they weren't just objects anymore. They were evidence of something monstrous, something living in my house, eating breakfast across from me, watching me with eyes that seemed to know too much. I sat on my bed, the door locked, my pocket knife clutched in my sweaty palm. The house was quiet, but every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the pipes, sent my heart racing. I kept replaying last night, the rumble of Grandpa's truck, the way he'd stood in the shed, silent, like he could smell my presence. Had he noticed the tarp was off-center? The notebook slightly askew? My flashlight left on the floor? I'd been careless, too panicked to cover my tracks perfectly. The thought that he might know I'd been in there twisted my stomach into knots. I hadn't gone to school today. I couldn't face the crowded hallways, the teachers' voices, the normalcy of it all when my world was unraveling. Instead, I stayed in my room, the articles from the library still hidden under my mattress, the key to the shed tucked in my sock drawer. I'd added notes about the notebook to my scribbled list. Laura, 1974, checkmark. Diane, 1983, no checkmark. Rebecca, 1990, checkmark. The checkmarks haunted me. What did they mean? Bodies found? Bodies hidden? I didn't want to know, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Mom knocked on my door around noon, her voice muffled. You okay, sweetie? You didn't eat breakfast. I mumbled something about a stomach bug, and she left it alone, her footsteps fading toward the kitchen. I couldn't tell her. Not yet. What if she didn't believe me? What if she confronted Grandpa, and he, my mind flinched from the thought. Those scarred hands, the way they gripped his coffee mug, the way they'd held that knife in my imagination. I couldn't risk it, not without something solid, something the police couldn't ignore. Night was the worst. The house turned into a maze of shadows, every sound amplified. I'd started sleeping with my desk chair wedged under the doorknob, my knife under my pillow. Around 2 a.m., I heard it, a slow, deliberate creak outside my door, the floorboards groaning under weight. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, my hand closing around the knife. The sound stopped, but I felt him there, standing just outside, silent, waiting. Minutes dragged by, each one an eternity, until I heard the soft thud of his boots retreating to his room, the door clicking shut. I didn't sleep after that, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, my heart pounding like it would burst. The next day, I forced myself to act normal. I went to school, sat through classes, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept seeing Grandpa's face, the way he'd looked at me over dinner last night, his eyes lingering a second too long when I dropped my fork. "Clumsy today, kid," he'd said, his voice low, almost amused. I'd forced a laugh, but it felt like glass in my throat. Did he know? Was he testing me? I started noticing things I'd missed before. The way he'd pause when Mom mentioned the news, the way he'd change the subject if she brought up old stories about Willow Creek. Once, I caught him staring at the backyard, toward the shed, his jaw tight, his hands clenched. I stopped eating much, my appetite replaced by a constant churn of dread. At school, my friends noticed, asking why I was so jumpy, why I kept checking my phone. I brushed them off, saying I was stressed about finals, but the truth was I was checking the news, searching for updates on missing persons, anything that might connect to Grandpa. I found a forum post about Willow Creek's cursed history, mentioning the creek and the old mill, places tied to the disappearances. Someone claimed the town was hiding something, that the police had looked the other way for years. It made me wonder if Grandpa had friends in high places, if that's why he'd never been caught. I started carrying my knife everywhere, tucked in my pocket, its weight a constant reminder of the line I was walking. I didn't know what I'd do with it, fight him? Defend myself? The thought made me nauseous, but I couldn't let it go. I kept replaying every interaction, searching for clues. The way he'd snap if I got near the shed, the way he'd lock his door every night, the way he'd watch me when he thought I wasn't looking. It was like living with a stranger, one who knew my every move. By Friday, I was a ghost of myself, my eyes sunken, my hands trembling. Mom cornered me in the kitchen, her face worried. "You look like hell, kid. What's going on?" I wanted to tell her, to spill everything, the lockbox, the shed, the notebook, but the words stuck. If she confronted him, if he knew I'd talked, what would he do? I saw the knife in my mind, the ropes, the check marks. I mumbled something about school stress and fled to my room, locking the door. That night, I heard his truck start up again, the engine's growl fading into the distance. I waited, counting the minutes, then slipped out to the backyard, checking the shed's padlock. It was still locked, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been in there, that he'd moved something, checked something. I stood there, the key burning a hole in my pocket, but I didn't dare go inside. Not yet. I was too scared of what I'd find, and even more scared of what would happen if he caught me. I went back to my room, the chair under the doorknob, the knife under my pillow. The house was silent, but it felt alive, watching me, waiting for my next move. I was trapped, caught between knowing too much and not enough, and every second in this house felt like a step closer to something I couldn't escape. The chair wedged under my bedroom doorknob creaked as I leaned against it, my pocketknife a cold weight in my hand, the darkness of my room pressing in like a living thing. It was October 18, 2024, and the memory of Grandpa's silhouette in the shed, his boots heavy on the floorboards, haunted me. The notebook I'd found, pages of names, dates, and chilling details, was a bomb ticking in my mind. Ellen Harper, Mary Klein, Susan Wells, Laura, Diane, Rebecca, and others, their lives catalogued in red ink, some marked with check marks that made my skin crawl. I hadn't slept properly in days, my body a taut wire, every noise in the house a potential threat. I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in a house with a man I was certain was a killer, but suspicion wasn't enough. I needed proof, hard, undeniable evidence that would force the police to act, that would make Mom believe me, that would keep me safe. I decided to go back to the shed. The thought made my stomach churn, but the notebook, the ropes, the Polaroids, they were the key. If I could get photos of them, clear ones, not the blurry mess I'd imagined in my panic last time, I could send them to the sheriff's office anonymously. No one could ignore that. But the risk was suffocating. Grandpa's poker game was tonight, his one predictable absence, giving me a narrow window. Mom was at the hospital, working another late shift. So the house would be empty. I just had to move fast and stay calm, two things that felt impossible with my heart hammering every second. I waited until 6:30 p.m., when Grandpa's truck rumbled out of the driveway, the taillights fading into the dusk. I stood at my window, watching until I was sure he was gone, then grabbed my phone, the shed key, and my knife, slipping them into my pockets. The backyard was dark, the oak tree's branches casting jagged shadows across the grass. The shed loomed at the edge of the lawn, its padlock glinting under the faint glow of the porch light. My hands shook as I crossed the yard, the key slippery with sweat. I glanced back at the house, half expecting to see Grandpa's face in the window, but it was empty, silent. The padlock clicked open, and I pushed the shed door, the hinges groaning like a warning. The smell hit me, oil, dirt, and that sharp metallic tang that matched the attic's lockbox. My phone's flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating the cluttered shelves, the rusted tools, the tarp in the corner. I knelt, pulling it back, my breath shallow. The wooden chest was there, its lid heavy, the padlock open, just as I'd left it. I lifted it, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped my phone. The Polaroids were still there, the ropes, the notebook. I started with the photos, snapping pictures of each one, Laura, Diane, Rebecca, their smiles frozen, the red-inked dates stark against the faded backs. My fingers fumbled, the flashlight beam jittering across the images, but I forced myself to keep going. The notebook was next. I opened it, the pages crinkling, and photographed every entry, my heart sinking with each name. Ellen Harper, blonde, 5 feet 4 inches, Route 17, July 12, 72, checkmark. Mary Klein, brunette, 5 feet 6 inches, diner, March 15, 81, checkmark. The list went on, a catalogue of lives snuffed out, some marked, some not. I checked for Claire Dunn again. 1998, the last date from the attic, but she wasn't there. Why? My mind raced, but I couldn't stop to think. I snapped photos of the ropes, the knots tight and frayed, and the knife, its stained blade catching the light. The images were blurry in places, my hands too unsteady, but they were clear enough. They had to be. I was halfway through photographing the last page when I heard it, the low rumble of an engine. My blood went cold. Grandpa's truck, back too soon. The poker game never ended this early. Headlights swept across the shed's grimy window, and I dropped the notebook, my phone slipping to the floor. I scrambled to grab it, my flashlight beam spinning wildly, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. I shoved the notebook back into the chest, pulled the tarp over it, and lunged for the back window, the same one I'd climbed through last time. The frame scraped my arm again, the cut from before stinging as I landed in the wet grass outside, my phone clutched tight. I crawled into the bushes, my breath ragged, my body pressed into the damp earth. Through the leaves, I saw Grandpa unlock the shed, his silhouette filling the doorway. He stood there, still, his head tilted like he was listening, sniffing the air. My stomach twisted, had I left something out of place? The flashlight? A photo? He stepped inside, his boots heavy, and I held my breath, my fingers digging into the dirt. Minutes dragged by, each one a lifetime, until he finally walked out, relocking the padlock with a deliberate click. He headed back to the house, his steps slow, his hands clenched at his sides. I didn't move until the kitchen light flicked on, then off, signaling he'd gone to his room. I stumbled to my bike, hidden in the neighbor's lot, and pedaled to a gas station a mile away, my hands shaking so badly I could barely steer. In the bathroom, under the harsh fluorescent light, I uploaded the photos to a cloud drive, my fingers fumbling on the screen. I typed out an anonymous tip to the Willow Creek Sheriff's Office, attaching the images, my message short, evidence in shed, 1423 Maple Lane. Check the chest. I hit send, my chest tight, and deleted the email from my sent folder, just in case. Back home, I slipped in through the back door, locking my room and wedging the chair under the knob. I checked the photos on my phone, the blurry images of the notebook and Polaroids staring back at me. They were enough, I told myself. They had to be. But as I lay in bed, the knife under my pillow, the house creaking around me, I couldn't shake the fear that I'd made a mistake. What if Grandpa checked the shed again? What if he knew it was me? The memory of his silhouette, standing in the doorway, lingered like a shadow I couldn't outrun. The glow of my phone screen burned my eyes as I lay in bed, the chair still wedged under my doorknob, my pocketknife a cold lump under my pillow. It was October 19, 2024, 2 a.m. And the house was silent except for the faint hum of the fridge downstairs. My heart hadn't stopped racing since I'd sent the anonymous tip to the Willow Creek Sheriff's Office hours ago, the blurry photos of Grandpa's shed, Polaroids, ropes, the notebook with its chilling list of names, uploaded to a cloud drive and attached to the email. Ellen Harper, Mary Klein, Susan Wells, Laura, Diane, Rebecca, their names and dates etched in red ink, some marked with check marks that made my skin crawl. I'd typed the message in a gas station bathroom, my hands shaking, evidence in shed, 1423 Maple Lane. Check the chest. Now, every creak in the house felt like a countdown, like Grandpa knew what I'd done, his scarred hands waiting to close around my throat. I hadn't slept, couldn't. My mind replayed the shed, the moment I'd heard his truck, the scrape of the window frame as I'd fled. Had I left something behind? A smudge on the chest? The tarp folded wrong? I'd been so careful, but panic made you sloppy. I kept seeing his silhouette in the shed doorway, standing there like he could smell my fear. The photos on my phone were proof, but they were also a noose around my neck. If he found out, if he even suspected, what would he do? The knife in the shed, its blade stained dark, flashed in my mind, and I gripped my own knife tighter, its cheap handle slick with sweat. Morning came too fast. I dragged myself out of bed, my eyes gritty, my body heavy like I'd been running all night. Mom was in the kitchen, pouring coffee, her nurse's scrubs wrinkled from an early shift. Grandpa sat at the table, his hands wrapped around his mug, the scars on his knuckles catching the light. I froze in the doorway, my breath catching as his eyes flicked up to meet mine. "Morning, kid," he said, his voice low, gravelly, the same as always but heavier now, like it carried a weight I hadn't noticed before. I mumbled a reply, my throat tight, and grabbed a granola bar, avoiding his gaze. Did he know? Could he tell I'd been in the shed again, that I'd sent those photos? I left for school, my backpack heavy with the articles still hidden under my mattress, the shed key in my sock drawer. The day was a blur, teachers' voices droned, my friends' chatter faded into noise. I kept checking my phone, expecting a news alert, a police report, anything to show the sheriff had acted on my tip. Nothing. Just silence. I searched for updates on Willow Creek's missing women, scrolling through old forum posts, my hands trembling. One post mentioned a retired deputy who'd claimed the police ignored leads in the 70s and 80s, too understaffed or too scared to dig deeper. Was that why Grandpa had never been caught? Did he have friends, connections, someone covering for him? I got home late, biking slow to avoid the house as long as possible. Mom was at work, and Grandpa's truck was gone, probably on one of his drives. I checked the shed's padlock from a distance, still locked, no sign of tampering. I wanted to believe the police were coming, that they'd raid the shed and end this, but doubt gnawed at me. What if the tip wasn't enough? What if they needed more? I thought about going back in, getting clearer photos, but the memory of his truck pulling up stopped me cold. I couldn't risk it again. Not yet. Dinner was torture. Grandpa was back, eating silently, his fork scraping the plate with slow, deliberate strokes. Mom talked about a patient at the hospital, oblivious to the tension choking the air. I watched his hands, the way they moved, steady but heavy, like they'd done things I couldn't unsee. "You're quiet tonight," he said suddenly, his eyes locking onto mine. My fork froze halfway to my mouth, my heart slamming against my ribs. "Just tired," I managed, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded, but his gaze lingered, sharp, like he was peeling me apart. That night, I lay awake, the chair under the doorknob, the knife in my hand. I kept my phone on, checking the cloud drive to make sure the photos were still there, safe. I deleted the email from my sent folder. But what if the police traced it? What if they showed up and asked questions, and Grandpa saw me talking to them? The thought made my chest tight, my breath shallow. I heard his door creak open around 3 a.m., his boots soft on the floorboards. He paused outside my room, the silence so heavy I thought I'd suffocate. I gripped the knife, my pulse roaring, until his footsteps moved away, the house swallowing him back into the dark. The next morning, I checked the news again, still nothing. I was unraveling, my nerves frayed, my body exhausted but unable to rest. I kept the knife in my pocket at school, my fingers brushing it every few minutes, a lifeline. I couldn't eat, couldn't focus. Every car on the street, every shadow in the hall, felt like him, watching, waiting. I was trapped, caught between the evidence I'd sent and the fear that it wasn't enough, that he'd slip through, that he'd know it was me. The house, the shed, the creek. They were all closing in, and I didn't know how much longer I could hold on. The morning sun sliced through my bedroom curtains, sharp and unforgiving, as I sat on the edge of my bed, my phone clutched in my hands, the screen dark. It was October 20th, 2025, and I hadn't slept, my body wired on fear and exhaustion, the weight of the anonymous tip I'd sent to the Willow Creek Sheriff's Office pressing against my chest. The photos of Grandpa's shed, the Polaroids, the ropes, the notebook with its chilling list of names, were safe in the cloud, but every second since I'd hit send felt like waiting for a bomb to go off. Ellen Harper, Mary Klein, Susan Wells, Laura, Diane, Rebecca, their names looped in my mind, their faces burned into my memory from the articles and the Polaroids. I'd done the right thing, I told myself, but the fear that Grandpa knew, that he'd seen through me, kept my knife under my pillow, my door locked, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. I'd barely left my room since sending the tip, avoiding Grandpa's gaze at breakfast, his voice cutting through the fog of my thoughts. "You're quiet, kid," he'd said last night, his eyes narrowing, his scarred hands steady on his fork. I'd mumbled something about homework, my throat tight, and fled to my room, the chair wedged under the doorknob. I kept checking my phone for news, for any sign the police had acted, but the silence was deafening. What if they hadn't taken the tip seriously? What if they'd traced it to me? The thought of Grandpa finding out made my stomach churn, the image of that stained knife in the shed flashing in my mind. At 8 a.m., the doorbell rang, a sharp chime that jolted me upright. I crept to my window, peeling back the curtain. 2 police cruisers sat in the driveway, their lights off but their presence heavy, like a storm about to break. My heart slammed against my ribs as I saw 3 officers on the porch, one holding a clipboard, another with his hand resting on his holster. Mom answered the door, her voice muffled but confused, and then I heard Grandpa's boots, slow and deliberate, crossing the living room. I stayed frozen, barely breathing, as I watched through the crack in the curtain. "Mr. Hargrove, we'd like to ask you some questions," the lead officer said, his voice calm but firm. Grandpa stood in the doorway, his frame filling it, his face unreadable. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone flat, the same gravelly drawl he used over coffee. My hands shook as I gripped the windowsill, waiting for them to mention the shed, the chest, the notebook. They didn't. Instead, they asked to search the property, citing an anonymous tip about suspicious items. Grandpa's jaw tightened, just for a second, but he nodded, stepping aside. "Go ahead," he said, his voice steady, but I saw his hands clench, the scars white against his knuckles. Mom followed them outside, her face pale, asking questions they brushed off. I stayed at the window, my breath fogging the glass, watching as 2 officers headed toward the shed. My pulse roared in my ears. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for, dreading. They unlocked the padlock with a key, had they gotten a warrant, and disappeared inside. I waited, seconds stretching into eternity, my mind racing. What if the chest was gone? What if Grandpa had moved it after I'd been there? But then I saw one officer step back, his hand on his radio, his face grim. The other emerged, carrying the wooden chest, its lid open, the Polaroids and notebook visible even from my window. I sank to the floor, my legs weak, relief and terror crashing together. They'd found it. The evidence was real, undeniable. But Grandpa was still there, standing on the porch, his arms crossed, watching the officers with that same blank expression. He didn't look at me, didn't glance toward my window, but I felt his awareness, like a shadow stretching across the yard. Mom was crying now, her hands over her mouth, shaking her head as an officer spoke to her, his words too low to hear. They cuffed Grandpa, his wrists bound behind his back, his movements slow, almost mechanical. He didn't resist, didn't speak, just stared at the ground as they led him to a cruiser. I watched, my heart a tangled mess of guilt and vindication. This was my grandfather, the man who'd taught me to ride a bike, who'd slipped me candy when Mom wasn't looking, but he was also the man in the notebook, the one tied to the creek, the mill, the women who'd vanished. The cruiser door slammed shut, and he was gone, the car pulling away, leaving the yard empty except for Mom, who stood frozen, her sobs cutting through the morning air. She came inside, her face streaked with tears, and saw me in the hallway. "What did you know?" she asked, her voice breaking. I couldn't speak, my throat closed tight, the weight of what I'd done crushing me. I'd betrayed him, but I'd had to. The Polaroids, the ropes, the check marks, they weren't just suspicions anymore. They were real. I shook my head, unable to meet her eyes, and retreated to my room, locking the door. The news hit by noon. My phone buzzed with alerts: Willow Creek man arrested in connection to decades-old disappearances. The articles mentioned the shed, the chest, DNA evidence linking to 3 missing women: Ellen, Mary, Susan. My anonymous tip had worked, but it didn't feel like a victory. I sat on my bed, staring at the wall, the knife still in my pocket, the chair under the doorknob. The house felt hollow, like it was holding its breath, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that I'd opened a door I couldn't close. The house was too quiet without Grandpa's heavy boots on the floorboards, his low muttering over coffee, his door clicking shut at night. It was October 21, 2025, and he was gone, hauled away in handcuffs yesterday morning after the police found the chest in the shed, Polaroids, ropes, the notebook with its damning list of names: Ellen Harper, Mary Klein, Susan Wells, Laura, Diane, Rebecca. The news called him the Willow Creek Killer, a monster who'd stalked our town for decades, his secrets buried under tarps and floorboards. I'd sent the anonymous tip that led to his arrest, the blurry photos from my phone exposing the truth, but sitting on my bed, the chair still wedged under the doorknob, my pocketknife in my hand, I didn't feel safe. The silence was louder than ever, and the weight of what I'd done pressed against my chest, a mix of relief and dread that kept me awake, my eyes fixed on the shadows. Mom hadn't spoken much since the arrest. She'd stood in the yard, crying as the police took Grandpa away, his face blank, his scarred hands limp in the cuffs. She'd asked me what I knew, her voice cracking, but I couldn't answer, couldn't face the betrayal in her eyes. We'd packed bags that night, moving to a motel on the edge of town, leaving the house behind like it was cursed. The motel room smelled of stale cigarettes and bleach, its thin walls letting in the hum of traffic, but it was better than staying in that house, where every creak felt like him, watching, waiting. I kept my knife close, my phone on, checking for updates. The news was relentless. DNA on the ropes and knife matched 3 victims: Ellen, Mary, Susan. They were still digging, searching for more evidence, more bodies, in the creek, the mill, the woods he'd known so well. Willow Creek was unraveling. Reporters swarmed the town, their vans clogging Main Street, their cameras flashing outside our old house. Neighbors whispered, their eyes darting away when they saw Mom and me at the gas station. The articles painted Grandpa as a ghost, a quiet mechanic who'd lived among us, unnoticed, while women vanished. I read every one, my stomach twisting at the details: Ellen's car on Route 17, Mary's purse by the creek, Susan's scarf near the mill. The notebook's entries matched too perfectly, the checkmarks a chilling code no one had cracked yet. Claire Dunn, 1998, the last date from the attic, wasn't in the notebook, and that gap gnawed at me. Where was she? Why wasn't she listed? Mom tried to shield me, turning off the TV when the news came on, but I saw it anyway, on my phone, in the papers left at the motel's front desk. How could we not know? She'd whispered last night, her face pale, her hands trembling as she poured coffee from the motel's cheap machine. I wanted to tell her about the lockbox, the shed, the tip, but the words stuck. I'd saved us, hadn't I? But I'd also torn our family apart, exposed a truth that left us both hollow. She didn't ask again, and I didn't offer, the silence between us growing heavier each day. I couldn't go to school. The thought of facing my friends, their questions, their stares, was too much. I stayed in the motel, my laptop open, digging through forums and old articles, searching for anything I'd missed. A local blog mentioned the Willow Creek Killer as a shadow over the town since the 70s, with rumors of police looking the other way, too scared or too lazy to dig deep. Was that how Grandpa had slipped through? Did he have friends, someone who'd turned a blind eye? The thought made my skin crawl, but it fit. He'd been so calm when the police arrived, so cooperative, like he'd expected it. Days blurred together, each one a cycle of checking news, avoiding Mom's eyes, and gripping my knife like it could protect me from the past. We moved to a rental apartment a week later, a small place with peeling paint and a view of the highway. The house on Maple Lane was taped off, a crime scene now, its windows dark, the shed a gaping wound in the yard. I didn't go back, but I saw it on the news, reporters standing in our driveway, talking about decades of terror. They found more in the shed, traces of blood, fibers, a second knife. The creek was being searched, divers combing the muddy bottom for remains. I stopped eating, my stomach a knot, the Polaroid's faces flashing every time I closed my eyes. Mom started seeing a therapist, her voice quiet when she thought I couldn't hear, talking about guilt, about how she'd grown up with him, never suspecting. I wanted to scream that I hadn't either, that I'd loved him, trusted him, until the attic, the shed, the truth. But I stayed silent, locked in my room, my knife under my pillow, my phone buzzing with alerts. The trial was months away, but the evidence was piling up: DNA, fingerprints, the notebook's meticulous records. Grandpa hadn't said a word, not to the police, not to a lawyer. His silence was louder than any confession. Then, last night, it came. A letter, slipped under the apartment door, no return address, just my name scrawled in black ink. I opened it with shaking hands, the paper cheap, the words inside written in red ink, uneven and jagged, like the notebook's entries: "You should have burned it." My blood went cold, my breath catching as I checked the postmark: Willow Creek, dated 2 days ago. Grandpa was in jail, locked in a cell 40 miles away, but the handwriting was his, the red ink a scream from the past. I locked the door, checked the windows, my knife in my hand, my heart pounding. Was it really him? Or someone else, someone who knew what I'd done? The house, the shed, the creek, they weren't done with me. I didn't sleep, and I don't think I ever will again.